I'm standing here before you as an Englishman about to talk on this topic of the Ancient Island Celts. And I have in the past been accused of having dark English nationalist motivations. And I should say that I do regard this story as also being about my own past, since, especially with a good Welsh name like James, I can claim probably Welsh or maybe Cornish ancestry. So as I say, this is very much about all of our shared history here. So what I'm going to present to you tonight is very much a tangled tale through which I'm going to, rather like a carpet page from the Book of Kells, which I'm going to try to trace what I think is the main thread, at least from my own perspective. And this story first actually developed in Britain, but it is also about Ireland, and it's increasingly involved Irish archaeological evidence and research. Now, I grew up, as I suspect most, if not all of you grew up, with the notion, with the traditional view that the recent non-English peoples of the Isles are Celtic. And even if what that means is not always very clearly or closely defined. And further, therefore, really, the ancestral ancient Britons and Irish of pre-Roman times who had arrived during the Iron Age of the last 700 or 800 years BC, the last phase of prehistory, they too were Celts. Now, crucially, these peoples left no writings of their own to tell us who they thought they were and how they came to be here. We are dealing with prehistory before the survival of written sources. We've often, in many accounts, we've often thought that these people arrived here from a Celtic homeland in Central Europe as ways of invaders, as the earliest of a series of invasions in early historic times which created the familiar ethnic and national makeup of the Isles. They were followed by Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans. And these immigrant Iron Age Celts brought with them characteristic culture comprising languages and peculiar social organisation, which is often shown in this kind of form. I could be rude about this drawing because I did it, with an elite of warriors and perhaps so-called men of art. Also peculiar religion and attitudes to death, maybe including headhunting, human sacrifice and so on. And also, not least, remarkable art. That artistic style, which is often referred to as Celtic, which academics refer to as the Latin style of curving line abstract art, particularly found on splendid items of jewellery and beautiful weapons. And they also built hill forts. We're dealing, in the traditional view, with warrior societies. Now, in these various regards, the Iron Age Isles form part of a huge ancient Celtic world, which stretched from the Atlantic to Turkey. And the continental bulk of this was subsequently overwhelmed by the Roman Empire, leaving the Isles and Brittany as the only surviving fragments. Now, this story, or versions rather like it, have become part of our received history. This kind of story has been largely taken for granted, really, by many scholars. It's the subject of popular books. Again, a lot of what I'm going to speak about this evening arose when I added to this range of popular books on the Celts. It's taught in schools, it's been taught in universities, and so on. And the way in which the Iron Age is commonly, often implicitly understood is rather like this schematic diagram I prepared some years ago. It's in terms of various characteristics which are thought to share roughly a common boundary, which define ancient Celtic people in Britain, Ireland, and on the continent. This notion which we might call Celticity, which is comprised of a notion of Celtic self-identity, Celtic languages, this form of early social structure I mentioned, peculiar religious rites, etc., Latin art and so forth. And we might add also, often people might add something like a notion of Celtic spirit or Celtic sensibility. But there were some cracks in this edifice developing over the last 30 years or so. This is something I came into partly kind of from outside, because as the Minister mentioned, I'm an archaeologist by training, and my day job, so to speak, is actually studying the Roman Empire and not least the Roman military. And one of the reasons I started getting very interested in people like the ancient Britons, was my main initial focus, was that I felt I couldn't understand what was happening with the Roman military in Britain if I did not understand the people they were actually interacting with violently and peacefully. And the other reason I got drawn into this work was I got a job shortly after I finished my PhD at the British Museum as an educational curator, and found myself very privileged to be responsible for teaching and talking to the public about the Romano-British collections, but also the prehistoric collections, including some of the great icons of Celtic art, like the Battersea Shield, which is a tremendously exciting thing to be able to do. This led me to study more closely the evidence of the European Iron Age so that I could communicate this to public visitors. And it was while doing this kind of work in the galleries of the British Museum that I really began to encounter problems with our understanding of the Iron Age Isles. As a Romanist, perhaps not surprisingly, I went back to look at the classical texts. Of course, many others have done this as well, I should say, but this, I'm just giving you my line of thought and how it developed here. Because if the ancient Celts left no writings of their own, they were certainly described and mentioned and discussed by their Greek and Roman neighbours. And what we have here, if we look at texts like Julius Caesar, here's an extract from his famous commentaries on the conquest of Gaul, he specifically says that in what is now France, there are people who in their own language call themselves Celts. So that is quite clearly established. But what I found fascinating as I looked at these classical sources and modern discussions of them is that no classical text refers to anybody in Britain or Ireland as Celtic or as Celts. What they did was they noted there were similarities, for example, between the Britons and the Belgae, either side of what is now the English Channel. But these were no more than similarities. These people were described as distinct. Incidentally, we should also say that Caesar and other writers do record and attest contradictory traditions on the origins of the islanders. There are one or two references which do mention recent regional invasions, such as Belgae, people called Belgae in around that part of Britain. But they also mention that many of the peoples of Britain regarded themselves as autochthonous, as actually coming from the soil. No clear classical account mentions mass Iron Age population movements into the Isles, which match the accounts which do exist for big population movements into, for example, northern Italy, down through the Balkans, and into central Turkey. Anyway, so we have islanders not being called Celts in antiquity, but of course they were still Celtic in language and culture, weren't they? That was certainly the position which I had at the British Museum in the mid-1980s. During that period, I was finding myself talking to a new generation of Iron Age archaeologists in Britain and found them in the middle of what scientists, suitable to this venue, refer to as a paradigm shift, a conceptual revolution in their thinking about the Iron Age, which was triggered by a number of roots, not least the evidence they were dealing with. And in fact, this is a site I myself was involved in excavating at the end of the 1970s. Since World War II, in Britain, there's been an absolute explosion of archaeological knowledge about the pre-Roman centuries, the Iron Age, going beyond the familiar hill forts and a handful of metalwork treasures with which we started. And surface surveys and aerial photographic surveys like this one have recovered entire Iron Age landscapes, thousands of settlements, largely of farms attesting productive agrarian societies. This particular site, as you can see here, consisted of 3 successive phases of Iron Age farmsteads in the last centuries BC. This is an air photograph. It was subsequently excavated, which is why we can date it closely. So this is the kind of landscape. This is what the British Iron Age largely consisted of, not people charging around in chariots, but people who are actually out in the landscape being farmers. When digging Iron Age sites like this, is a particularly famous example at Gussage All Saints in Dorset, archaeologists expected to find evidence of the Celtic invasions they knew had happened, which were part of this received history. But the more they looked for the invaders, the more they weren't there. And instead of cultural discontinuity and settlement by intrusive warrior societies radiating from the continent in the Iron Age, what they found was something quite different. They found basic continuity from the preceding Bronze Age, going back to the 2nd millennium BC, in many of the basic features of society, such as house design, roundhouses, pottery traditions, farming regimes, burial rites. These things looked indigenous Bronze Age rather than incoming Continental Iron Age. There was, of course, clear evidence of continental contacts and interactions, particularly later in the Iron Age. Most obviously, continental-inspired metalwork. This example here, incidentally, from the River Soar near Leicester, where I work these days, is probably a rare example of an actual continental import, but it is a very rare one. Metalwork inspired by the continent, and also new ideas like coinage coming in from undoubtedly that source as well. It's absolutely clear that some people were crossing the seas, but they're probably doing it in both directions, and possibly only in quite small numbers. And instead of fairly uniform Celtic societies, archaeologists were discovering cultural diversity. Again, coming through from multiple diverse cultural traditions of the island's Bronze Age, with further regional divergence down to the Roman incursions in the last century BC. Some examples here. If we go to Wessex, which is one of the best explored Iron Age landscapes, then what we find there in, for example, the Middle Iron Age is what's characterised as a very egalitarian farming landscape, consisting of large numbers of farms with some hill forts some of the time, but really very little evidence of any kind of warrior aristocracy or specialised priesthood, people like druids and so forth, which we tend to expect when we think of Iron Age Celtic societies. It's a very, very, very flat society. And if we go to southeastern England, to the end of the Iron Age, to the period immediately before the Roman conquest, here we have something that's quite the opposite. We have, in the southeast, we have a series of quite centralising and sophisticated kingdoms developing, and proto-urban centres, places like Camulodunum. There is the later Roman and then medieval city of Colchester, and this vast area here was an enormous centre of late Iron Age power of a royal house with a series of royal burials. The whole is defined by enormous earthworks, and these royal burials attest diplomatic contacts, very close exchanges with the nearby Roman Empire. These are sophisticated kingdoms. And many of these societies in Iron Age Britain, it's very difficult to shoehorn them into the sort of traditional view of Iron Age Celtic tribal societies.